My name is Captain Emily Shore, United States Air Force. In the cramped living room of the Reyes family, thick with the heavy salt-soaked air of coastal North Carolina, my father had just handed down what felt like a public sentence. The space was small to begin with, but now it was suffocating, overflowing with the grief and bodies of a close-knit military community in Jacksonville. This town doesn't just host the Marine Corps, it breathes it. Around here, the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem holds more reverence than the American flag itself. The air clung to my skin, a blend of bitter, overbrewed coffee and the bland, comforting aroma of tuna noodle casserole someone had set out. To me, it was the scent of tragedy in small-town America. A few men stood in their dress blues, posture as stiff as their polished collars, while their wives murmured rehearsed condolences that landed with mechanical precision instead of warmth. And in the middle of it all was my father, retired Marine Corps Colonel Michael Caine, a legend from Paris Island. He was a statue of pressed fabric and uncompromising principle, his very presence drawing every ounce of air from the room. One of his hands rested on the trembling shoulder of Mrs. Reyes, whose son, Corporal Reyes, had just been taken prisoner overseas. His voice, deep and gravelly from decades of barking orders, rumbled through the room with the familiar script: honor, sacrifice, the brotherhood of the Corps. I had slipped in quietly through the back, my own Air Force blues feeling like a foreign costume in this sea of scarlet and gold. I was an analyst, a creature built for data and silence, and here, that made me an outsider. Every head turned when I stepped inside. Conversations died mid-sentence. My father's gaze locked on me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the silence weigh down on me, letting the eyes of the entire room press into my skin. Then, without looking away, he spoke, not to me directly, but to everyone, with words meant only for my ears. "Your spreadsheets can't stop a bullet, Emily." The words hit me like a shove to the chest. This wasn't just a dismissal. It was a public verdict. In front of a grieving community, my father had branded me useless. My world of logic and analysis was, in his eyes, nothing but a pointless game in the face of real violence. Mrs. Reyes looked up at me, her face a portrait of confusion and grief. Her tear-filled eyes seemed to ask a question she couldn't bring herself to voice. Should she thank me for trying or blame me for failing? Someone pressed a cold glass of sweet tea into my hand. Droplets slid down my fingers, but I couldn't drink it. The syrupy sweetness would have lodged in my throat. But that suffocating living room was not my true world. My world exists in a windowless, climate-controlled room at Pope Air Force Base, bathed in the cold blue-white glow of a dozen monitors. The steady hum of servers fills the air as they process petabytes of global data. I am Captain Emily Shore, but on the Global Signals Intelligence Network, I am Echo. I don't hear gunfire. I hear the digital shadows it leaves behind. I hear the gaps between transmissions, the faint hitch in a low-priority signal that betrays its true weight. I hear the nearly invisible frequency shift in a drone's data link, the subtle hesitation in an encrypted voice feed. I recognize the patterns hiding inside a billion fragments of chaos. My job is to catch what isn't being said. Just last month, those silences led me to the coordinates of a concealed chemical weapons depot. My analysis, quiet lines of code passed up the chain, enabled a special forces unit to destroy it before it could threaten civilians. Hundreds of people are alive today who otherwise wouldn't be. There was no parade for that, no ceremony. Just a single encrypted email that appeared on my screen 24 hours later. Mission successful. Thanks, Echo. That is my battlefield. A place of invisible victories and silent wars. A world my father, with his faith in steel and gunpowder, could never and would never want to understand. I sat in the cool darkness of my office, his voice replaying in my head like venom dripping slow. My fingers were steady over the keyboard, but they trembled slightly as I reached for the top drawer of my desk. Past neatly stacked regulations and files, my hand found the worn paperback tucked at the back. The spine was creased, the pages softened from years of being held, daring greatly by Brené Brown. It was the last gift my mother gave me before cancer claimed her. I could still hear her voice, thin from illness but hard as steel, as she lay in the hospital bed. I had been watching a Breen Brown talk on my laptop when she looked at me, a faint smile playing on her lips. "They won't understand you, Emily," she whispered, her breath tinged with antiseptic and fading hope. "They will always glorify the warrior in the arena with the sword. But don't you ever let the fear of their judgment stop you from stepping into your own arena. True courage is showing up and letting yourself be seen, even when there are no guarantees. The credit belongs to the one in the arena, whose face is marred by dust, sweat, and blood." My father's words echoed again. Sharp, cruel. Your spreadsheets can't stop a bullet. But my mother's voice was louder, and it anchored me. It was the promise I had made to her, and to myself. He could keep his stage and his audience. I had my own arena, and I would not be silenced. That promise was tested just 2 days later. The arena I was pushed into wasn't one I would have chosen. It was a sterile, windowless interrogation room inside the Office of Special Investigations at the base. The only splash of color in that interrogation room came from the American flag standing stiff in the corner and the glinting silver of the pilot's wings on my interrogator's chest. Across the cold steel table sat Major Cade Jennings, an F-35 pilot, the kind of golden boy the Air Force loves to put on recruiting posters. His jaw looked like it had been chiseled from stone, his smile practiced and easy, but it never reached those eyes. Those eyes were sharp, assessing, the way a predator studies something it's already decided is prey. Jennings embodied the other side of the Air Force, the kinetic, high-glory side. The pilots. The parade material. And he was looking at me as if I were a glitch in his perfect system. He leaned back casually, his fingers tapping out a lazy, self-assured rhythm on the tabletop. Then his index finger drifted to tap the polished wings above his heart, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that said I fly. "You type." "Captain Shore," he began, his voice a smooth baritone shaped by a lifetime of being obeyed. "Let's skip the formalities. The access logs show your authentication code was the last one to touch the Predator drone's data stream before the command link was compromised." He paused, eyes locking on mine. "Corporal Reyes, he's a childhood friend of yours, isn't he?" The words hung in the cold, recycled air. A little hometown loyalty, perhaps? Maybe that loyalty was misplaced. He wasn't asking, he was making an accusation, each syllable another brick in the wall of suspicion he was building around me. He was painting the picture of a sentimental woman whose emotions had eclipsed her duty, whose personal ties had caused a disaster. It was a clean, easy narrative. And it was completely false. The room seemed to shrink, the air thinning, not from lack of oxygen, but from the sheer weight of his prejudice pressing against my chest. In that moment, I wasn't Captain Emily Shore, intelligence officer. I was a suspect. The verdict came quickly. I was stripped of my duties. My access to the network revoked. My credentials, my lifeline, deactivated. They took my badge, and with it, the key to my entire professional world. I was grounded, silenced, cut off. The organization I had pledged my loyalty to now looked at me like an enemy. I retreated to the sterile, silent confines of a temporary off-base apartment. The walls felt like they were closing in. Desperation slid in under the door like an unwelcome draft. That night, my encrypted phone buzzed with a single, anonymous message. Waffle House I-95. 2 a.m. I didn't need to guess who sent it. Leo Vance, a civilian analyst in my section. Brilliant, eccentric, and usually terrified of bending so much as a minor rule. For him to reach out like this meant the risk was monumental. The Waffle House was a pool of fluorescent light in the empty black of Interstate 95, a familiar beacon for long-haul truckers and third-shift soldiers from Fort Bragg and Pope. I slid into a cracked final booth, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee, sizzling bacon, and maple syrup. Leo was already there, hunched over a plate of hash browns like a nervous bird guarding crumbs. He didn't look up when I sat. His eyes stayed fixed on his plate. "They wiped the primary server, Emily," he murmured, barely louder than the clink of a spatula on the grill. "Said the file was corrupted during the breach." He darted a quick glance around the diner before sliding a small black flash drive across the sticky tabletop, hiding the motion beneath a napkin. But Aegis Dynamics. Their system always creates a ghost backup on a partition drive. Proprietary. They don't even tell the DoD it exists. His gaze flicked up once, just for a second. Be careful. They're not just investigating you. They're building a case. He stood abruptly, dropped a $10 bill on the table, and walked out without another word, never once looking directly at me. Even here, he was afraid of being caught on camera showing me loyalty. I was radioactive. Back at my apartment, the only light came from my personal laptop. I slid the USB into the port. The directory was a maze, layer after layer of phantom folders and mislabeled files. Leo had been right. They'd buried this deep. Time blurred. The city outside went silent. My mind fell into the familiar rhythm of analysis. I wasn't just reading code. I was listening for the syntax of a lie, the tempo of a cover-up. Then I saw it. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a ghost. A parasite of code, elegant and vicious, woven deep into the drone's operational software. Its purpose was perfect in its simplicity. Mimic the authentication signature of the last authorized user, open a data stream, and then erase itself, leaving the mimicked signature as the only trace. This wasn't the work of an outsider. It wasn't some random hack from the outside. It was a backdoor, built and planted from within. A chill far colder than anything I'd felt in that interrogation room slid through me. I traced the parasite's signature back to its source. It led straight to the core encryption software, a program called Ironclad. And Ironclad wasn't just any product. It was the crown jewel of Aegis Dynamics, the same defense contractor where my father, Colonel Michael Caine, served as the lead consultant. My heart didn't just skip, it felt ripped from my chest. Finding the ghost in the machine wasn't a triumph. It was the start of a more personal kind of hell. Because before I could even begin to process that my father's company was tied to this, the official story of my failure swept through the base like wildfire. Rumor is the bloodstream of any closed military community, and that week, I was the infection everyone wanted to talk about. The hammer dropped during a mandatory base-wide security briefing in the Post Theater. I sat in the back, trying to make myself small, but I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes. Whispers rustled through the room like dry leaves. Then Major Cade Jennings took the stage, his flight boots gleaming under the harsh lights. He wasn't there to inform. He was there to prosecute. He stood with the stillness of a predator, scanning the auditorium until his gaze locked on me with surgical precision. As part of our ongoing investigation into the recent intelligence breach, he announced, his voice smooth and amplified by the mic, we are examining every possibility. He let the pause stretch long enough for every head to follow his line of sight straight to me. That includes the possibility of human error, potentially compromised by personal sentiment. The air seemed to vanish. He hadn't said my name, but he didn't need to. With one calculated sentence, he'd branded me as a lovesick liability, a woman whose emotions had crippled her judgment. It felt like 1,000 invisible needles were holding me in place. The faces turned toward me were a gallery of cold judgment, detached curiosity, the occasional flicker of pity, and, from most, undisguised contempt. I kept my spine straight, my expression neutral, but inside I was fracturing. That night, back in the suffocating quiet of my apartment, I did the only thing that still felt like an option. I called my father. From my window, I watched the distant runway lights at Pope Air Force Base, beacons of the world I belonged to, yet was suddenly exiled from. As C-17's landing lights cut through the night, a reminder of the order, purpose, and power I'd devoted my life to. I still had a shred of hope that he, Colonel Michael Caine, U.S. Marine Corps, would see reason, would hear the truth, and stand with me. He picked up on the second ring. Dad, I began, my voice tight, I found something. I think there's a problem with the Aegis software. I didn't get to finish. The problem is you, Emily, he cut in, his tone no longer gravelly warmth but sharp, lethal ice. You and your damn virtual world. Corporal Reyes is out there, God knows where, being tortured because your system failed. Do you understand that? You turned a United States Marine into a number on a screen, a blip on a map. Each word hit like shrapnel, shredding what was left of my defenses. But Dad, it's a backdoor. I can prove. Don't call me again, he snapped, the command absolute. Then the line went dead. The click was sharp, final. It was followed by the hollow, endless drone of a dial tone. I stood frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the sound of nothing. That silence was heavier than any of his words. It wasn't just anger. It was rejection. He hadn't simply turned away. He'd shoved me into the abyss and cut the rope. Have you ever heard a silence so loud it screams? The kind that comes when the one person you thought would save you is the one who pushes you over the edge. My strength gave out. The phone slid from my fingers and hit the cheap linoleum with a dull clatter. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, curling in on myself. The tears came then, hot, silent, carving tracks through the foundation I'd worn to the briefing earlier that day. I was alone, an enemy to my service, a failure to my community, and now a disgrace to my own father. I let myself break. I let the grief, the rage, and the raw injustice flood through me in the darkness. But slowly, the heat in my tears began to cool. The sobbing faded, replaced by ragged, measured breaths. The pain wasn't disappearing. It was changing. It was solidifying into something colder, sharper, useful. I pushed myself up, legs trembling, and walked to my desk. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass of the monitor, a pale, hollow-eyed ghost. With a deliberate click, I woke the screen. In the corner of the monitor was a yellowed index card I'd taped there years ago, bearing a quote my mother had loved from Theodore Roosevelt. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." I whispered the rest aloud into the stillness, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. My gaze shifted from the yellowed quote to the glowing code on my screen, the digital fingerprint of the ghost, my battlefield. A cold, crystalline resolve settled in my chest. I brushed away the last traces of tears. My hands were steady now. "I will prove it," I said softly, but with a quiet, dangerous certainty. Not for him. For Reyes. And for me. The resolve I had clawed from the floor of my apartment hardened into armor. Grief and fury compressed into fuel. Yes, I was suspended. My clearance revoked. Shut out from the very systems I'd sworn to defend. But they couldn't confiscate my mind. They couldn't strip away my training. And they sure as hell couldn't close the doors of a public library. My new headquarters became the Cumberland County Public Library in downtown Fayetteville, a quiet, anonymous sanctuary with the scent of aging paper and floor wax. Here, surrounded by the gentle rustle of turning pages, I was nobody special. Just another person using public Wi-Fi on a battered burner laptop. My father's world was made of noise, explosions, and brute force. Mine was built on patterns, logic, and the devastating power of silence. Here, in the quiet, I went to war. For 2 days, I pored over the parasitic code Leo had given me. I'd never seen anything like it. Modern malware usually has a certain logic, a recognizable structure built from languages like Python or C++. But this was something else entirely. Chaotic. Illogical. Almost alive. It didn't follow rules. It broke them. Every known exploit, every backdoor technique I could think of, led me to a dead end. I leaned back, rubbing my burning eyes, and remembered something a military history professor once told us at the academy. Every empire rots from within, not by the enemy's sword, but by its own arrogance. And arrogance was all over this code. Its creators hadn't bothered to hide it. They simply assumed no one would ever be clever enough to untangle it. Then, staring at one particularly tangled string of commands, I froze. It wasn't a programming language. It was a language. My brain jolted back 20 years, to a sweltering summer I'd spent in a university library, teaching myself to read cuneiform tablets for fun. My father had laughed in my face when he found out. Sumerian? What in God's name is a Marine's daughter doing with a dead language? Useless hobby of a bookworm, Emily. Useless. But now my fingers flew across the keyboard. I wasn't a programmer anymore. I was a translator. Applying the grammatical structure of ancient Sumerian, subject, object, verb, postpositions instead of prepositions, the chaos began to resolve itself into order. The code snapped into place, revealing a structure that was terrifying in its precision. I wasn't staring at gibberish anymore. I was reading intent. And that's when the truth hit me, not with triumph, but with a cold, nauseating certainty. The ghost wasn't built just to steal data. That was secondary. Its primary function was something far more insidious. It was designed to create a phantom echo. Dormant until it detected a high-priority data transfer, it would awaken, copy the credentials of the last authorized user, open its own secret transfer, and then, this was the genius, rewrite the system's access logs with a flawless forgery. The forged record would show the legitimate user performing the illegal action. It wasn't just a spy tool. It was a weapon of blame. A machine built to manufacture scapegoats. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a vulnerability. It was deliberate, coded, tested, and deployed on purpose. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. I opened a secure, anonymous email client. My mind was sharp, focused. One recipient, General Isabella Martinez, Commander of Air Combat Command. One sentence, Aegis Ironclad wasn't breached. It was born with a key. The effect was immediate. 2,000 miles away at Langley Air Force Base, General Martinez read the message on her secure tablet. A woman who had fought her way to 4 stars in a man's world. She didn't get there by swallowing easy answers. She called Major Cade Jennings to her office. He walked in with that same smug confidence, expecting a commendation. Major, she began evenly, though her tone carried the edge of a blade. I want you to halt the human error angle of your investigation immediately. Jennings's smirk faltered. General, with all due respect, the evidence against Captain Shore is conclusive. Your evidence, she cut in, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, is now in question. You will submit an official request to Aegis Dynamics for the uncompiled source code for Ironclad. We're bringing in an independent third party to audit it. Jennings's face flushed with irritation, his jaw clenching. To him, this was a ridiculous detour, a challenge to what he considered an airtight case. General, that's highly irregular. A civilian contractor's proprietary code. That is an order, Major, Martinez cut in, her tone leaving no space for debate. Get it done. For the first time, Cade Jennings looked uncertain. He snapped it tight. Yes, ma'am, then turned on his heel. The swagger was gone. The seed of doubt had been planted. And I was the one who'd planted it. But that fragile seed didn't even have time to take root before the entire world caught fire. The investigation shifted overnight from a slow, smoldering case into a raging inferno. It started with a video file, one that bypassed every standard firewall and landed directly inside the OSI's primary communication channel. It was a message from hell. On the screen, Corporal Danny Reyes knelt in a bare concrete room. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, his uniform torn. But his eyes were still clear. Defiant. A man stood behind him, pressing a gun to his head, while another forced him to read from a typed statement, a list of demands and threats. In the corner of the video, a red digital countdown clock appeared against the gray wall. Midnight, the clock had started. In the OSI command center, I knew Jennings and his team were seeing exactly what the captors wanted them to see, a hostage, a threat, a ticking deadline. But I wasn't listening to the words Reyes spoke. I was listening to how he spoke them. As a linguist, I know cadence, stress, intonation. And Danny, my childhood friend, was speaking in a way I'd never heard from him before. He was subtly changing the rhythm of his sentences, putting unnatural emphasis on certain words, swapping others entirely. They'd made him read Psalm 23, a passage we'd both memorized back in Sunday school. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But that's not what he said. He said, the Lord is a shepherd, I shall not be wanting. A tiny change. Meaningless to anyone else. To me, it was a flare in the dark. It was our code, one we'd invented as kids, a private joke turned into a signal. A shepherd, one guard. Be wanting, a window. Piece by piece, he was describing his surroundings. The layout of his prison, disguised inside mangled Bible verses. Everyone else saw a hostage. I saw an intelligence source. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I compiled my analysis, the linguistic deviations, the probable meaning, the implications of a coded message, and pushed it through a secure back channel to General Martinez's office. But I knew how military bureaucracy worked. My report would be vetted, reviewed, and debated by half a dozen committees before anyone acted. Danny didn't have that kind of time. The clock was already down to 23 hours, 47 minutes, and 16 seconds. I still had an advantage. They didn't know about the ghost in the machine. The back door. They were still using the compromised comms link, confident in their encryption. They had no idea it was leaking like a sieve. They had no idea I could hear them. I slid on my headset. My personal laptop was now my only portal to the outside world. I became a ghost myself, listening. They were tense, agitated, arguing. And then I heard the words that froze my blood. Move him at dawn. New location. The American witch is listening. They were spooked. And they were going to move him. If that happened, he'd disappear forever. I had to act. No. This was the line. On one side, my career, my freedom, my life. On the other, Danny's. Crossing it meant violating a direct suspension order. Unauthorized access to a classified network. Open and shut court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Prison. My mother's voice came back to me from that dog-eared Breen Brown book. True courage is daring to fail spectacularly. I took one long, steady breath. And I stepped over the line. Using a cloaked access protocol I'd built years ago, a digital skeleton key for emergencies, I slipped back into the network. I didn't hit them head-on. I didn't brute force their defenses. That was my father's style, not mine. I started a conversation. I began sending an endless stream of infinitesimal data packets into their system, each one disguised as harmless noise, a network hiccup, a dropped bit, a corrupted byte. Invisible, untraceable, but not empty. Inside each packet was a payload, not a virus, a message. I'd studied their online activity for days. I knew their culture, their folklore, deeply superstitious, steeped in tales of vengeful spirits and cursed souls. So I decided to give them a ghost to fear. The data packets I sent began to whisper through their network. Lights in their compound flickered without warning. A speaker would spit out a burst of static, just long enough for the human brain to think it heard a voice. I dug through local historical archives, pulling the names of figures from their own ghost stories, and hid them in the metadata of their traffic. I wasn't trying to save Danny Reyes with a predator drone. I was trying to save him with a ghost story. I let their own superstitions work against them, seeding paranoia, planting fear, letting their imaginations do most of the heavy lifting. The clock ticked down, 19 hours, 21 minutes, and 44 seconds. I wasn't an analyst anymore. I was a puppeteer, yanking the strings from half a world away and praying they'd make the wrong move before time ran out. But my psychological warfare worked too well. Instead of slowing down, my haunting pushed them over the edge. The flickers, the whispers, they didn't just spook them. They made them desperate. Panicked, they abandoned their 24-hour deadline. They decided to execute Corporal Reyes immediately and broadcast it live as their final act of defiance. The feed in the Langley Air Operations Center switched from the recorded video to a raw live stream. On the massive wall display, Danny was yanked to his knees. A rough black hood was pulled over his head. The cold barrel of a pistol pressed hard against his temple. The countdown clock was gone. This was no longer a threat. This was now. The most powerful air force in the world's nerve center erupted into chaos. Colonels barked orders that were instantly overruled by other colonels. Technicians hammered at keyboards, their faces lit by the cold glow of their screens, but every trace led to a dead end. The signal bounced like a phantom through a dozen proxy servers across 3 continents. No matter what they tried, they couldn't pin it down. And in the middle of it all stood Major Cade Jennings, frozen. The ace pilot. The golden boy. A statue in flight boots. His skin had gone pale, his trademark confidence replaced by the slack-jawed stare of a man watching something he couldn't fight. His jets were useless. His missiles meaningless. In that room, wrapped in the metallic taste of failure, hope was evaporating fast. Then a sharp, definitive sound cut through the noise, a flat palm slamming down on the polished command table. The crack echoed like a gunshot, and in an instant the chaos stopped. Every head turned. Every voice went silent. General Isabella Martinez stood at the head of the table, a still point in the storm. Her gaze was a laser, not fixed on the screen, but on Jennings. "Major," she said, her voice soft but slicing straight through the silence, "your skills are not the ones we need. Everything you were trained for is irrelevant here." It wasn't an insult. It was a surgical fact. Then she turned away from him, shoulders squared, radiating an authority that bent the whole room to her will. Facing the primary communications console, she raised her voice, not shouting, but delivering an order with the weight of a thunderclap. "On a clear channel, every station, every channel, hold all traffic. Get me a Priority 1 secure patch to Captain Emily Shore's personal line. Now." The words hit the room like an alien signal. She let them settle before adding the payload. "Find Echo. I need Echo on the line." For most, the name meant nothing. For a few, it was a shockwave. A ripple of confusion swept through the ranks as officers glanced between the general and Jennings. I could see the bewilderment in their faces shift to dawning, impossible realization. "Echo? Who the hell is Echo?" "Emily Shore. The suspended analyst." Jennings looked like the ground had vanished beneath him. His mouth hung open, disbelief and humiliation written across his face. He had been the critic, the judge, and now he was about to watch the condemned step into the spotlight. A young airman at the comm station, fingers flying, broke the silence. "Ma'am, I have her. Secure line is live." And then my voice filled the speakers, calm and steady, the opposite of the panic that had gripped the room seconds earlier. "General, this is Echo. I'm on." Have you ever been in a moment when everything was falling apart, and then one voice, just one, cut through the noise and shifted the entire world? That's what they heard. A collective exhale rippled through the room, half disbelief, half relief. "I've been monitoring their internal comms for the last 10 minutes, I said, my voice steady, measured, professional. "The ghost story worked. They're panicking, and panic makes people sloppy. I have their exact coordinates, General, but their internal network is hardened. If we're going to save him, I need you to authorize Protocol Chimera." If hearing Echo had stirred confusion, Chimera sent a visible ripple of fear through the room. Chimera wasn't just a classified protocol, it was a myth, whispered about in the deepest corners of cyber warfare doctrine. It wasn't designed to slip in quietly. It was designed to erase. A digital scorched earth strike that could gut an enemy's entire infrastructure, power grid, communications, automated defenses, in one sweep. The weapon of last resort. And I, the suspended, disgraced captain, had just asked for the keys. Protocol Chimera worked. It didn't just work. It was devastating in its elegance. 1 second, the compound was alive with power. The next, it was a tomb. The lights went dark. The comms went dead. Automated defenses flatlined. The live feed vanished mid-frame. In that instant of engineered silence, a Delta Force unit moved in under the cover of total blackout, guided by the coordinates I'd provided. 2 hours later, the official word came through. Corporal Danny Reyes was safe. Alive. On his way home. I was suddenly the hero of the hour. Suspension lifted. Access restored. The same officers who had barely concealed their contempt now offered curt nods of respect. But it felt hollow. The ghost in the machine was still out there. I had treated the symptom, not the disease. I buried myself in my after-action report, documenting every step of the operation with clinical precision. And then I found it, hidden deep in the cache of the compromised drone. A fragment of a deleted file. A single, encrypted email. It was sent a full month before Ironclad was rolled out across our drone fleet. My blood ran cold as I decrypted the headers. From a lead engineer at Aegis Dynamics to Colonel Michael Kane, my father. I opened the body of the message. The words were technical, detached, but the meaning was like a knife. "Colonel Kane, sir, our final stress tests have revealed a potential backdoor vulnerability in the Ironclad encryption suite. Low probability, but exploitable. We recommend a full delay of deployment to patch the flaw. Please advise." I read it again. And again. And again. It was impossible. He knew. He had known there was a weakness. And he'd approved the deployment anyway. The man who had looked me in the eye and accused my virtual world of failing, of reducing a Marine to a number, had signed off on a system capable of doing exactly that. The ground beneath me cracked open. My chest tightened, squeezing the air out of my lungs. Without thinking, my fingers dialed the number I'd known by heart my whole life. He answered on the first ring. His voice, for the first time in weeks, sounded almost proud. "Emily, I heard the news. Reyes is safe." "Hell of a job." I cut him off. My own voice was unrecognizable, low, trembling, but edged sharp as broken glass. "Why, Dad?" "Just that." The silence on the other end was long and heavy, filled with everything he wasn't saying. When he finally spoke, it was with the weary sigh of a man too tired to hide anymore. "It was a calculated risk," he said, flat, emotionless. "Aegis promised me a seat on the board. A significant compensation package." He paused. "And besides, I wanted to prove a point. To show those bookworms in the Air Force that their precious technology fails. That it can't save them." The world went quiet. It wasn't a mistake. Not negligence. Not oversight. It was a deal. A deliberate, cold-blooded trade. My father had weighed the life of a Marine, a boy he'd known since birth, mentored, called his godson, against a corporate title and a paycheck. He'd gambled with Danny's life to win a petty ideological argument. The image of him standing in the Reyes living room, his hand on a grieving mother's shoulder, flashed in my mind. The hypocrisy was so complete it knocked the breath from my lungs. "You knew," I whispered, the first tear sliding hot down my cheek. "You knew there was a flaw. And you did it anyway." He didn't deny it. Didn't explain. Just silence. And that silence was the worst confession of all. The silence of a man who had made his choice and would live with it. I ended the call. This time I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. I didn't break. The tears stopped. No rage. No fire. No storm. Just a vast, frozen emptiness where, for 35 years, my love and admiration for my father had lived. It was gone. And in its place was the cold, echoing truth of his betrayal. Several weeks after the phone call that shattered my world, I found myself in Las Vegas. Not the glittering, neon-soaked playground the tourists know, but the serious, no-nonsense Las Vegas of Nellis Air Force Base, the kind of place where the stakes are measured in lives, not poker chips. I was there for the annual Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Symposium, a gathering of the sharpest minds in the military. Analysts, cryptographers, drone pilots, strategists, my people. And yet, I still felt like an outsider. I slid into a seat in the back row of the massive auditorium, the emptiness inside me stretching out as wide and barren as the Nevada desert just beyond the walls. Down in the front row, in a chair reserved for honored guests, sat my father. Keynote speaker, representative for Aegis Dynamics, scheduled to talk about the future of public-private partnerships and national security. The irony was enough to choke me. He was about to be celebrated for the very system that had nearly killed a Marine, a betrayal only the two of us knew. Or so I thought. The lights dimmed. A hush fell. General Isabella Martinez walked to center stage, owning the space with a presence that drew every eye. "Good morning," she began, her voice sharp and clear. "We're here today to talk about the future of warfare, hypersonic missiles, next-gen stealth. But first, I want to talk about the most powerful weapon system we have, the human mind." A murmur moved through the crowd. "The battles of tomorrow," she continued, sweeping her gaze across the sea of uniforms, "will be won not only by those who fly above the clouds, but by those who can see through the darkness from the ground." She paused, letting the moment breathe. "Today, we honor a silent hero, an officer who proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it." A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. My heartbeat picked up. "This hero," Martinez said, her voice gaining strength, faced suspicion from her peers and isolation from her command. She was doubted, dismissed, nearly broken. But she did not step back. With nothing but her intellect and her duty, she navigated a web of lies to save the life of a United States Marine and expose a fatal flaw that threatened every single person in this room. The general smiled then, a rare, genuine smile. It is my distinct honor to ask you to join me in welcoming to the stage the woman we have come to know as Echo, Captain Emily Shore." The name detonated in the room like a sonic boom. There was a beat of stunned silence, then the sound of a single pair of hands clapping. Another joined, then another. And suddenly the entire auditorium was on its feet in a rolling wave of applause. Hundreds of officers, analysts, and pilots, the elite of the Air Force, were standing. In the crowd, I saw Major Cade Jennings. His hands moved mechanically, his face flushed crimson with shame. He was applauding the woman he had tried to destroy. I sat frozen for a moment until someone beside me nudged my arm. "Captain, that's you." My legs felt disconnected from my body as I stood. I walked the aisle in a dream, moving through the wall of sound toward the stage. The lights hit me like a flashbang. I shook Martinez's hand, my mind blank, and looked out at the sea of faces. My gaze found him. Front row. My father. He was the only one not standing. A stone figure in a field of motion. The Titan of my childhood looked smaller under the lights. Older, his face slack and gray. He didn't move. Didn't clap. He just watched me. Our eyes locked. I searched his face for anger, for defiance, for that old glint of contempt. It wasn't there. All I saw was a vast hollowness. The look of a man who had just watched the kingdom he'd built, his philosophy of steel and strength, collapse into dust. He knew that I knew. And in that silent exchange, he understood that he had lost. Completely. The ovation at Nellis was a public vindication. But inside, the hollow space remained. The truth about my father was still mine alone, a private weight I carried in silence. I returned to duty. The whispers of suspicion became murmurs of respect. But nothing inside me had shifted. The war was over. Peace still felt far away. Then, a week later, the story broke. Not a leak, a confession. Retired Marine Corps Colonel Michael Caine had walked into the Pentagon and handed the Inspector General a full, detailed report on the Aegis Dynamics ironclad software. Internal emails. Test data. A sworn statement admitting his own role in approving the flawed system. He gave them everything. Enough to bring down the company, and himself. In one calculated act, he detonated his consulting career, obliterated his reputation, and torched his future. He made himself the villain of the story, ensuring Aegis would be too busy with federal investigations to even think about retaliating against me. It was the only truly brave thing he could have done. An act of penance, not in words, but in the cold, hard currency of self-sacrifice. He did it in silence. He did it my way. I was in my new, larger office at Langley when the package arrived. Plain cardboard. No return address. My name and station scrawled on the label in a familiar blocky hand. My hands were steady as I cut through the tape. Inside, cushioned in a bed of white tissue paper, was a small black velvet box. No letter. No note. No explanation. Just the box. I flipped it open. On a bed of worn, faded silk lay his eagle, globe, and anchor, the EGA. Every Marine earns one upon completing boot camp, but it's more than a pin. It's identity. Creed. Soul. Forged in metal. This one was old. The bronze dulled in spots from decades of polishing and holding. The one he'd worn on his dress blues for 30 years. I lifted it from the box. The metal was cool and heavy in my palm. This wasn't a gift. And it wasn't an apology. It was surrender. An unconditional admission. He was placing the most sacred emblem of his world into my hands, telling me in his silent way that my arena, the one built on silence, data, and patterns, was just as valid as his of mud and blood. It was his way of saying I was a warrior, too. Beneath the box, something else was hidden in the tissue paper, a faded photograph, its corners soft from years of handling. I was 10 years old, all gap-toothed grin, perched on my father's broad shoulders during a 4th of July parade. He was in full dress uniform, looking up at me with a rare, unguarded smile. A moment of uncomplicated love, frozen in time before our worlds split apart. I turned it over. On the back, in the shaky, spidery handwriting of an old Marine, were 6 words. You were always the better soldier. That's when the tears came. Not the hot, angry tears of betrayal, not the shattering sobs of grief. These were slow, quiet, cleansing. It wasn't forgiveness. What he'd done, the betrayal, the choice to gamble with another man's life, would always scar us. That truth would never be erased. But this was closure. I held the photo in one hand and the cool weight of the EGA in the other, and for the first time, the two worlds, his and mine, felt like they could exist together. The need for his approval, the sting of his dismissal, the crushing weight of his betrayal. All of it finally lifted from my shoulders and drifted away. The war was over. 6 months later, the world looked different. I wasn't locked in a windowless room, watching screens and listening to silence. I was standing in a sunlit classroom at the United States Air Force Weapons School at Nellis, home of the best of the best. Not a student, an instructor. I'd been tasked with building and leading a new curriculum on integrated cyber warfare and signals intelligence. My students were the sharpest young intelligence officers in the service. Bright, eager, hungry. They didn't call me Echo anymore. An echo repeats what it hears. It's passive, a reflection of a sound that's already passed. Now they called me Signal. A signal initiates, guides, leads the way forward. I had taken the pain, the isolation, and the betrayal and forged them into a legacy. Not for myself, but for those who would come after me. One afternoon after class, a young captain approached. Diaz. Brilliant. Her analyses cut sharper than anyone else's, but she walked under a cloud I knew too well, doubt. Ma'am, she said, clutching her data slate like a shield. I'm not sure my analysis on the last simulation was solid enough. I think I might have missed something. I don't want to disappoint the team. The old me would have given her a technical fix. Rerun the data, trust the numbers. But I wasn't the old me. I looked her in the eye, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Captain, I said, my voice quiet but certain, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's stepping into the arena anyway, terrified you're going to get your ass kicked, and doing the work. Your analysis was more than solid. It was sharp. It was intuitive. Trust it. Trust yourself. Her eyes widened. A flicker of confidence sparked. She nodded, a small smile forming. Thank you, ma'am. She walked away with her shoulders straighter, her step lighter. And in that moment, I knew I was breaking the cycle. Later, I stood in my office, looking out over the vast Nevada desert under a brilliant blue sky. On my desk, 2 objects sat side by side, my father's eagle, globe, and anchor, scarred, worn, and my mother's dog-eared copy of Daring Greatly. For the first time, they didn't feel like symbols of 2 opposing worlds. They were just my story. Steel and vulnerability. Warrior and scholar. The reminder of everything it took to get here. I finally understood. True strength isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about empowering others to find the right in themselves. My father had believed legacy was the rank on your collar, the medals on your chest. He was wrong. Legacy is measured not by the enemies you defeat, but by the warriors you raise. Not in your victories, but in the sparks you ignite in others. It's in those quiet moments when you see someone you've guided take their first step into their own arena. As the sun set, shadows stretched across the desert floor, and I smiled. Not with triumph, not with vindication, with peace. I was no longer an echo of anyone's expectations. I was a signal, and I was just getting started. My arena was a world of signals and silence. But the truth? We all have one. It might be a boardroom, a classroom, a hospital room, or even a dinner table with your family. It's that place where your courage is tested the most. So I'll ask you, what's your arena? Tell me about a time you stepped into it, even when you were afraid. Share your story in the comments. And if you believe in the quiet heroes who find their voice, subscribe and ring the bell.